The rattling subway car screeched through the dark tunnels, its flickering fluorescent lights casting an eerie glow over the weary passengers. Among the late-night travelers was an elderly woman, her frail hands clutching a worn leather handbag. Her name was Margaret Jenkins, a retired schoolteacher who had spent the evening visiting her sister across town. Dressed in a wool coat and a cloche hat reminiscent of a bygone era, she exuded an air of quiet dignity, but her tired eyes betrayed her vulnerability, a fact not lost on the man who had been watching her since she boarded. Before we start, hit the like and subscribe buttons for more exclusive news. In the far corner of the car sat Trevor Marks, a wiry man in his late 20s with sharp features and a restless energy. He wore a faded hoodie and jeans that had seen better days. Trevor was no stranger to desperation. A string of poor choices and hard luck had landed him in a cycle of petty crime. As he eyed Margaret's handbag, his fingers itched with a mix of guilt and resolve. It wasn't personal, he told himself. It never was. It was just survival. What Trevor failed to notice, however, was the imposing figure sitting a few rows behind him. Shaquille O'Neal, the legendary basketball player turned larger-than-life personality, had taken the subway that evening as part of an impromptu decision to reconnect with the people of the city he loved. Despite his fame, Shaq often sought moments of anonymity, finding solace in blending into the mundane rhythm of ordinary life. But blending in was no small feat for a man standing over 7 feet tall, with a charisma that drew attention even in the most crowded places. As the train lurched to a halt at the next station, a few passengers exited, leaving the car sparsely populated. Trevor saw his chance. Rising from his seat with feigned nonchalance, he moved toward Margaret, who was now engrossed in rummaging through her handbag for a piece of butterscotch candy. With practiced ease, Trevor leaned in, his voice low but firm. "Hand over the bag, lady," he said, his eyes darting around to ensure no one was watching too closely. Margaret gasped, clutching the bag tighter. "Please, I don't have much," she stammered, her voice trembling. Trevor's face hardened. "Don't make this harder than it has to be." Before Margaret could respond, a deep, resonant voice cut through the tense silence. "Yo, man, what do you think you're doing?" Trevor froze. Turning slowly, he looked up, way up, into the face of Shaquille O'Neal. Shaq stood, his massive frame towering over everyone in the car. The sheer size of him was enough to make Trevor reconsider every life choice that had led to this moment. "Mind your business," Trevor said, though his voice lacked the conviction it had moments earlier. Shaq chuckled, a low, rumbling sound that seemed to vibrate through the entire subway car. "Oh, this is my business," he said, stepping closer. "You think you can mess with someone like that and get away with it while I'm around?" The tension in the car was palpable. Margaret looked between the two men, her fear giving way to a flicker of hope. Trevor, on the other hand, was weighing his options. He could try to run, but where? The subway car was a closed space, and there was no escaping Shaq's reach. He could fight, but one look at Shaq's hands, each one large enough to palm a basketball, made that idea seem laughable. "Look, man, I don't want any trouble," Trevor said, raising his hands defensively. I just needed some cash." Shaq's expression softened, though his stance remained firm. "You think this is the way to get it? Stealing from an old lady? Come on, man. You're better than this." Trevor hesitated. It had been a long time since anyone had spoken to him like that, not with anger or disdain, but with an odd mix of authority and understanding. For a moment he saw himself through Shaq's eyes, a desperate, lost soul clinging to a frayed sense of dignity. "Just give her the bag," Shaq continued, "and maybe we can figure something out." Trevor sighed, the fight draining out of him. Reluctantly, he handed the bag back to Margaret, who clutched it tightly against her chest. "I'm sorry," he mumbled, avoiding her gaze. Margaret nodded, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. "Thank you," she said softly, though it was unclear whether she was addressing Trevor, Shaq, or both. Shaq placed a hand on Trevor's shoulder, a gesture that, coming from anyone else, might have been reassuring. From Shaq, it was both comforting and an unmistakable reminder of his physical dominance. "Let's take a walk," he said. It wasn't a suggestion. The subway car pulled into the next station, and Shaq guided Trevor onto the platform. Margaret watched them go, her heart still racing but filled with gratitude. The other passengers, who had been too stunned or too frightened to intervene, murmured among themselves, the surreal scene already becoming fodder for tomorrow's stories. On the platform, Shaq and Trevor stood face to face. The basketball star crossed his arms, his gaze steady. "What's your deal, man? Why you out here pulling stunts like that?" Trevor shrugged, shoving his hands into his pockets. "Life's tough. No job, no money. People don't care. You do what you gotta do." Shaq nodded slowly. "I get it. Life ain't always fair. But you can't let that turn you into someone you are not proud of." Trevor scoffed. "Easy for you to say. You've got it all." Shaq leaned in, his voice low but firm. "You think I got here by taking the easy way out? By stealing from people? Nah, man. I worked my tail off. And yeah, I've been lucky too. But you got to hustle the right way." Trevor looked away, the shame creeping in. "I don't know where to start." Shaq smiled, his expression softening. "First step? Apologize to that lady. Second step? Figure out what you're good at. And third? Don't be afraid to ask for help." Trevor looked up, meeting Shaq's eyes. For the first time in a long while, he felt something stir inside him, something that resembled hope. "You think it's that easy?" Shaq chuckled again. "Ain't nothing easy about it, but it's worth it." As the next train approached, Shaq reached into his pocket and pulled out a $100 bill. "Here," he said, handing it to Trevor. "This isn't for stealing, it's for starting fresh. Don't waste it." Trevor stared at the bill, then back at Shaq. "Thanks," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Shaq nodded. "Don't thank me. Thank yourself when you turn things around." The train doors opened, and Trevor stepped inside. As the car pulled away, he watched Shaq standing on the platform, larger than life and radiating a quiet strength. For the first time in years, Trevor felt the weight of possibility pressing against his chest. Back on the original train, Margaret sat quietly, her heart still fluttering. She couldn't wait to tell her sister about the unexpected hero who had saved her, and perhaps, in the process, saved someone else too. As the subway rumbled onward, Margaret stared at her reflection in the window. The events that had just unfolded felt like a dream, or perhaps a scene from one of those dramatic television shows she used to watch with her late husband. Her frail fingers caressed the worn leather of her handbag, which carried not just her possessions but also the memories of a long, well-lived life. She thought of the towering man who had come to her rescue, Shaquille O'Neal. She'd heard his name before, on the news or perhaps in conversations overheard on the streets, but never imagined she'd meet him in person, let alone in such extraordinary circumstances. Her thoughts drifted to Trevor, the would-be thief. Despite the fear she had felt, Margaret couldn't shake the sadness that his hollow eyes had evoked. His apology, quiet and sincere, lingered in her mind. Life, she knew, wasn't black and white. People weren't inherently good or bad. They were shaped by the choices they made, often under circumstances beyond their control. Perhaps, she thought, Trevor had simply taken a wrong turn and needed someone to guide him back. Meanwhile, Trevor sat in the subway car on his way to nowhere in particular. The $100 bill Shaq had handed him felt heavier than it should, as though it carried the weight of expectations he wasn't sure he could meet. He turned it over in his hands, his mind racing. What did Shaq see in him that he couldn't see in himself? Hope? Potential? Trevor had spent years convincing himself that the world didn't care, that he was destined for failure. And yet, in those brief moments on the platform, Shaq's words had pierced through the thick armor of cynicism Trevor had built around himself. He leaned back against the seat and closed his eyes, the rhythmic clatter of the train soothing his frayed nerves. He thought about the choices that had led him here, dropping out of school, losing touch with his family, and falling into the trap of easy money. Each decision had seemed insignificant at the time, but together they had created a spiral that felt impossible to escape. But now, for the first time in years, Trevor felt a spark of something different, a faint but undeniable urge to change. As the train screeched to a halt at the next station, Trevor made a decision. He wasn't sure where he was going, but he knew he couldn't keep going the way he had been. He tucked the bill into his pocket and stepped off the train, breathing in the cold night air. The city was vast and unkind, but tonight it felt different, alive with possibilities. Shaq, now back on the train heading uptown, leaned against the door, his massive frame barely fitting into the narrow space. The subway wasn't his usual mode of transportation, but he relished the anonymity it sometimes afforded him. Tonight, however, had been far from ordinary. He thought about Trevor, the young man who had tried to rob Margaret. Shaq had encountered plenty of people like Trevor in his life, lost souls trying to survive in a world that often seemed stacked against them. He couldn't save everyone, but he'd learned that sometimes a single act of kindness could plant the seed for change. Shaq glanced at the other passengers, most of whom were sneaking furtive glances at him. He smiled to himself. It wasn't every day you saw a 7-foot-tall former NBA star riding the subway. He didn't mind the attention. In fact, he welcomed it. To him, being approachable was part of the responsibility that came with his fame. His mother had always taught him to use his blessings to help others, and tonight, he felt he'd done just that. Still, his mind wandered to Margaret. The bravery she had shown in standing her ground, even when faced with danger, was remarkable. Shaq admired her resilience and couldn't help but wonder about the life she had lived. What stories did she carry in that handbag? What trials and triumphs had shaped her into the person she was today? As the train neared his stop, Shaq resolved to do more. He didn't believe in coincidences. If he had been on that subway car tonight, it was for a reason. Maybe Margaret, Trevor, and even the other passengers had been brought into his life to remind him of something he'd forgotten in the whirlwind of fame and fortune. That real change started on the ground, one person at a time. The next morning, Margaret awoke to sunlight streaming through her lace curtains. She felt a strange sense of peace, despite the ordeal she had endured the night before. As she prepared her tea, she replayed the events in her mind, marveling at the courage of her unexpected savior. She resolved to write a letter to her local newspaper, not to seek attention, but to share her gratitude and perhaps inspire others to act with courage and compassion. Sitting at her small oak desk, she picked up a pen and began to write. Dear editor, I want to share a story about kindness, courage, and second chances. Last night, while riding the subway, I was the victim of an attempted robbery. The experience was terrifying, but what happened next was nothing short of extraordinary. Margaret wrote for an hour, her words flowing freely. When she finished, she folded the letter carefully and placed it in an envelope. She would mail it later that afternoon, after her daily walk to the park. Across the city, Trevor was taking his first tentative steps toward a new life. He'd spent the morning wandering the streets, his mind buzzing with possibilities. He thought about Shaq's words. Figure out what you're good at. The problem was, Trevor didn't know what that was anymore. He'd been so caught up in survival that he'd forgotten what it felt like to dream. As he passed a community center, a flyer caught his eye. Job Skills Workshop, all are welcome. Trevor hesitated, his old doubts creeping in. What if they judged him? What if he wasn't good enough? But then, he thought of Shaq, the way he'd looked at Trevor with something resembling belief. That was enough to push him through the doors. Inside, the atmosphere was warm and welcoming. A middle-aged woman with kind eyes greeted him at the front desk. Welcome? Are you here for the workshop? Trevor nodded, his voice barely above a whisper. Yeah, I think so. Well, you've come to the right place, she said with a smile. We're here to help. As the day unfolded, Trevor found himself immersed in a world he hadn't experienced in years. He learned about writing resumes, preparing for interviews, and building a network. For the first time in a long time, he felt a flicker of confidence. By the end of the workshop, he had a plan. Find a job, any job, and start building from there. Shaq, too, was busy that day. Inspired by the events on the subway, he had spent the morning making calls to friends and colleagues in the city. He wanted to do more to help people like Trevor, people who had the potential to turn their lives around but needed a little guidance. By the afternoon, he was sitting in a conference room with representatives from local charities, discussing ways to expand programs for at-risk youth and adults. Sometimes all it takes is one chance, Shaq said, his voice resonating with conviction. We've got to be the ones to give it to them. The meeting lasted hours, but by the end, Shaq had a plan. He would fund a new initiative aimed at providing job training, mentorship, and support for individuals struggling to find their way. It was ambitious, but Shaq knew that change never came easy. That evening, Margaret mailed her letter, Trevor submitted his first job application in years, and Shaq finalized the details of his new program. None of them knew it, but their lives were now interconnected, their actions rippling outward in ways they couldn't yet imagine. The next day, Margaret's story appeared in the local newspaper, sparking a wave of interest. Readers were inspired by her resilience and Shaq's act of heroism, and the story quickly went viral. Soon, news outlets were clamoring to interview both Margaret and Shaq. Trevor, too, found himself caught in the wake of the story, though his role remained anonymous. The renewed attention gave Shaq's initiative a powerful launch. Donations poured in, and volunteers lined up to help. Trevor, who had started attending regular workshops at the community center, was invited to share his experience at one of the program's events. Nervous but determined, he stood before a room full of strangers and spoke about the night on the subway, the kindness he had been shown, and the choices he was now making. "It wasn't just about the money," Trevor said, his voice steady despite the lump in his throat. "It was about someone seeing me, not as a thief, but as a person who could do better. That changed everything." The audience erupted in applause, and Trevor felt something he hadn't in years: pride. For the first time, he believed in himself. Margaret Jenkins, once content to live quietly in her retirement, found herself stepping into a role she never anticipated: that of a public advocate. After the story of the subway robbery and her dramatic rescue spread, she began receiving invitations to speak at community centers, schools, and even police precincts. Initially hesitant, she considered herself a private person, not a public figure. She was convinced by her sister to give it a try. Her public appearance was at a local senior center where she spoke about the importance of community vigilance and supporting vulnerable members of society. Standing at the front of the room, her voice quivered at first, but as she recounted her encounter with Trevor and Shaq, she found strength in her own narrative. She described not just her fear, but also the compassion she felt for Trevor and the gratitude she held for Shaq. "What I learned that night," Margaret said, "is that our actions, big or small, can create waves of change. If we look out for each other, if we refuse to turn away from someone in need, we can make a difference." The speech was met with thunderous applause. A local reporter covering the event wrote an article highlighting Margaret's message, framing her as the subway advocate. The name stuck, and Margaret embraced it with grace. Margaret began working with grassroots organizations to improve public safety measures for seniors in urban areas. She spearheaded an initiative to install better lighting in subway stations, recruit more security personnel, and increase public awareness about reporting suspicious activities. In time, her efforts contributed to a citywide campaign called Safe Commute NYC, which became a model for other cities. For Trevor Marks, the subway encounter had been the lowest point of his life, but also the turning point. The $100 bill Shaq gave him was more than money. It was a symbol of trust and an unspoken challenge to do better. Trevor carried that bill in his wallet for weeks, refusing to spend it, as if to remind himself of the promise he'd made. Through the job workshop, Trevor secured part-time work at a neighborhood diner. It wasn't glamorous, but it was honest, and for the first time in years, he felt the satisfaction of earning his own way. His co-workers, a lively group of cooks and servers, welcomed him without judgment, and their camaraderie became a source of comfort. Trevor's supervisor, Carla, noticed his determination and took him under her wing. "You've got potential, kid," she told him one night as they cleaned up after the dinner rush. "Don't waste it." Encouraged by her words, Trevor began taking night classes at a local community college. He chose social work as his field of study, inspired by the impact people like Shaq and the workshop volunteers had on his life. Juggling work and school wasn't easy, but Trevor was determined to push through. His first big test came when a former acquaintance from his old life approached him outside the diner, trying to pull him back into petty crime. "Come on, Trevor," the man said. "You know this job ain't gonna get you anywhere. Let's hit a quick score just like old times." Trevor's jaw tightened as he shook his head. "Not anymore," he said firmly. "I've got plans." The man laughed, but Trevor didn't waver. Walking away from that conversation felt like shedding a heavy weight, and he realized just how far he'd come. His transformation wasn't complete, but he was finally moving forward with purpose. Shaquille O'Neal was no stranger to philanthropy. He'd been involved in charitable work for years. But the encounter with Trevor and Margaret reinvigorated his commitment to making a direct, tangible impact. Shaq launched the Second Chances Initiative, a nonprofit aimed at helping individuals rebuild their lives after incarceration, addiction, or periods of homelessness. The initiative quickly gained traction thanks in part to Shaq's celebrity status. Corporate sponsors lined up to contribute, and the program expanded to include mentorship opportunities, job placement assistance, and mental health resources. Shaq personally visited the centers, using his larger than life presence to inspire participants. "You're not defined by your mistakes," Shaq often told them. "You're defined by what you do next." One of the standout participants in the program was a young woman named Jasmine, who had aged out of the foster care system and struggled to find stability. Through the initiative, she enrolled in a vocational training program and eventually landed a job as an electrician. At a gala celebrating the program's successes, Jasmine gave an emotional speech, crediting Shaq for giving her a chance when no one else would. "You changed my life," she said, tears streaming down her face. "Now I want to help others the way you helped me." The audience erupted in applause, and Shaq felt a deep sense of fulfillment. Moments like this reminded him why he had taken the subway that fateful night, a decision that seemed random but was anything but. The story of Margaret, Trevor, and Shaq became a cultural touchstone, sparking conversations about community responsibility, redemption, and the power of compassion. Social media buzzed with hashtags like #SubwayHero and #SecondChances. News outlets ran follow-up pieces exploring how one moment on a subway had set off a chain reaction of positive change. Filmmakers took notice, and within a year, a documentary titled The Subway Redemption premiered at a major film festival. The film featured interviews with Margaret, Trevor, Shaq, and others who had been influenced by the story. It delved into themes of urban isolation, systemic inequality, and the small acts of courage that could bridge those divides. Critics praised the documentary for its raw honesty and uplifting message. One review described it as a testament to the resilience of the human spirit and the extraordinary connections forged in ordinary places. Margaret, Trevor, and Shaq attended the premiere together, walking the red carpet as a trio. For Trevor, it was a surreal experience. He had gone from a nameless thief to a symbol of redemption, all because someone had believed in him. Margaret, ever humble, downplayed her role, saying, "I was just in the wrong place at the right time." But Shaq corrected her with a grin. "Nah, Margaret, you were exactly where you were meant to be." Inspired by the story, communities across the country began organizing their own initiatives to address issues like poverty, crime, and mental health. In New York City, where the incident took place, a grassroots movement called Subway Guardians emerged. Volunteers patrolled subway stations not as vigilantes, but as helpers, offering assistance to those in need and deterring criminal activity through their presence. One notable member of the Subway Guardians was a retired firefighter named Mike. He had been struggling with depression after leaving the force, but found new purpose in helping others. "It feels good to be part of something bigger than yourself," he said during an interview. "I may not be able to save lives the way I used to, but I can still make a difference." The program also inspired younger generations. High school students organized fundraising events to support local charities, while college groups hosted discussions on urban safety and social justice. The ripple effects of Margaret's encounter with Trevor and Shaq reached farther than anyone could have imagined. 2 years after the subway incident, Margaret, Trevor, and Shaq reunited at a community event celebrating the success of the Second Chances initiative. The event was held at a bustling city park where families gathered, live music played, and booths showcased stories of transformation. Trevor, now working as a social worker, approached Margaret with a broad smile. "Mrs. Jenkins," he said, using the respectful tone he had learned as a boy, "I can't thank you enough for forgiving me that night. Your kindness changed my life." Margaret patted his hand gently. "Oh, Trevor, you've done all the hard work yourself. I'm just glad you found your way." Shaq joined them, his presence as commanding as ever. He placed a hand on Trevor's shoulder and another on Margaret's. "You two are living proof that it doesn't take $1 million program to change lives, just people willing to care." As the sun set over the park, the three of them posed for a photograph that would later be framed and displayed at the headquarters of the Second Chances initiative. It captured the essence of their journey, three individuals brought together by chance who had turned an act of desperation into a story of hope. Long after the initial headlines faded, the impact of that subway encounter continued to resonate. Trevor became a mentor in Shaq's initiative, guiding others through the difficult but rewarding path to redemption. Margaret's advocacy work led to policy changes that made public spaces safer for everyone. And Shaq, always humble despite his towering stature, remained committed to lifting others up, one person at a time. Their story became a legend, passed down through speeches, articles, and documentaries. It was a reminder that even in the darkest moments, there was potential for light, that a single act of courage, whether by standing up for someone or offering them a second chance, could create ripples that change the world. Trevor's journey of transformation had turned him into something of a local hero. Now a licensed social worker, he dedicated his days to helping others escape the same traps that had once ensnared him. He worked at a bustling community center in Brooklyn, where his office walls were adorned with certificates, motivational posters, and photographs of the people he had mentored. Trevor's work wasn't easy. Many of his clients arrived at the center feeling as lost as he once had. Individuals battling homelessness, addiction, or histories of incarceration. Trevor understood their struggles on a deeply personal level, and his ability to empathize made him an invaluable resource. His approach was rooted in a belief that no one was beyond redemption, a philosophy he credited to Shaq's words on that subway platform. One of his most challenging cases was a young man named Luis, who had been caught up in gang life from an early age. Luis initially resisted Trevor's attempts to help, dismissing his outreach as empty platitudes, but Trevor's persistence eventually broke through. "I've been where you are," Trevor told him during one particularly heated argument. "I know what it's like to feel trapped, to think you've got no way out, but I also know it doesn't have to be that way." Over time, Luis began to trust Trevor, attending job training workshops and therapy sessions. A year later, he secured an apprenticeship as a mechanic, crediting Trevor for helping him see a future beyond the streets. Watching Luis succeed filled Trevor with a sense of purpose that made every struggle worth it. Margaret Jenkins had become a symbol of resilience and grace. Though she never sought fame, her role in the subway incident continued to inspire people from all walks of life. At age 84, she remained active in her advocacy work, traveling to schools, libraries, and senior centers to share her story. Margaret's message had evolved over the years. While she still spoke about public safety, she also focused on themes of forgiveness and the importance of intergenerational understanding. She often recounted how, even in the most frightening moments, she had recognized humanity in Trevor, and how that recognition had paved the way for his redemption. One of Margaret's proudest accomplishments was the launch of the Jenkins Compassion Initiative, a program designed to foster connections between seniors and at-risk youth. Through workshops, storytelling sessions, and community events, the initiative created opportunities for mentorship and understanding. The program was so successful that it expanded to other cities, proving that small acts of empathy could build bridges across generations. Margaret continued to receive letters from people who had been touched by her story. One particularly moving note came from a high school student who had organized a fundraiser for the Jenkins Compassion Initiative. "Your bravery taught me that it's never too late to make a difference," the student wrote. Margaret kept the letter framed on her desk as a reminder of the lasting impact one person could have. Shaquille O'Neal's Second Chances initiative had grown into a national movement, with programs in over 20 cities across the United States. But Shaq wasn't content to stop there. He began collaborating with international organizations to expand the initiative's reach, visiting communities around the world to share his message of hope and redemption. During a trip to Nairobi, Kenya, Shaq met a group of young men who had once been part of a notorious street gang. With the help of a local nonprofit, they had turned their lives around, becoming mentors to other at-risk youth. Shaq was deeply moved by their stories, which mirrored the struggles he had seen in the United States. "Redemption isn't just an American idea," Shaq said during a press conference in Nairobi. "It's a human idea. No matter where you're from, no matter what you've been through, you deserve a second chance." Shaq's work abroad brought him into contact with world leaders, philanthropists, and activists, all of whom were inspired by his commitment to creating meaningful change. Yet, despite his global reach, Shaq remained grounded in the communities that had shaped him. He continued to visit the original centers in New York City, checking in on the people who had been with him from the start. One quiet evening, Trevor found himself riding the subway home after a long day at work. The familiar hum of the train brought back memories of that pivotal night years ago. As the train pulled into a station, an elderly man struggled to lift a heavy bag onto the car. Without hesitation, Trevor stepped forward to help. "Thank you, young man," the man said with a warm smile. Trevor nodded, a faint smile tugging at his lips. It's no problem. As the train resumed its journey, Trevor gazed out the window, reflecting on how far he had come. He thought of Margaret and Shaq, of the countless people who had supported him, and of those he had helped in return. Their stories were intertwined, a testament to the power of human connection. Margaret, too, often reflected on that night. Sitting by her window with a cup of tea, she would think about the chain of events that had unfolded and the lives that had been changed. Though her body was growing weaker with age, her spirit remained unyielding. She continued to write letters, give talks, and inspire others, determined to leave the world a little better than she had found it. As for Shaq, he remained as dynamic and dedicated as ever, a towering presence not just in stature, but in impact. He often spoke of that subway encounter as a reminder of why he did what he did. It's not about the big plays or the trophies, it's about the people you touch along the way. In the end, the subway incident was more than a story of a robbery thwarted. It was a story of humanity, of the courage to intervene, the strength to change, and the compassion to forgive. It was a story that would live on not just in headlines or films, but in the lives of everyone it had touched. If you like this video, please give it a like and subscribe to our channel. Also, could you leave your comments below and tell us, what are your thoughts on the thief's choice? We want to hear from you. Thank you for watching and see you next time.